We bumped into you at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. You were in the room, I believe, when Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick delivered that speech. How controversial was it?
Well, it was controversial, I suspect, but he didn't think it was controversial. It was a dinner. It was the welcoming dinner from the hosts of the chair of the World Economic Forum, which is now co-chaired for at least an interim period of time by two people, Larry Fink and Andres Hoffman from the Hoffman-LaRoche family, and they had about 5 speakers who spoke, and Howard Lutnick was the last speaker who spoke, and it was something that got people's attention, I'll put it that way.
Is it curious that he was the one to deliver this message? The first time I ever met Howard Lutnick was at Davos years ago before he was Treasury Secretary. He's talking about the global elite. Well, no offense, Mr. Commerce Secretary, but wasn't he part of one that now is saying he disowns?
He is a unique figure, and I think he's gotten a lot of leeway by the president to negotiate a lot of these deals, and I think he's very much enjoying the job, being my impression. I co-hosted a lunch with Dina Powell later in the week, and he came to that lunch and spoke as well, and his message is pretty consistent, so I think he's not going to change, and he's pretty happy in the job, and I think the president seems to be happy with him. So
that is a very diplomatic answer. Overall, what did you make of this year's Davos?
Well, it was a transition because Klaus Schwab, who built it more than 50 years ago, was no longer the chair. He wasn't there. And so they had new leadership. I think there were more CEOs than they've ever had before. They had more foreign leaders. Virtually every European leader showed up. And clearly, when the President of the United States shows up, it tends to dominate the news. And a lot of people stood just watching President Trump's speech for an hour or so. And everybody was waiting for the punchline. And the punchline that people were expecting didn't show up, which was that he was going to use military force. That didn't show up. So that was the big news. And I think people were relieved about that generally.
I welcomed some of the developments in the last week. It just felt like corporate America has shifted away from virtue signaling, and we're just focused on business now. Is that your sense of a shift as well? Did you witness that last week?
Well, after the Greenland thing kind of went away a bit, people are focused on the Fed. And though, as you pointed out already, the Fed's decision is pretty much as well known for today. And then people are looking at earnings, and people are wondering where the deficit is going, the debt, the U.S., and also whether there's going to be a government shutdown. And I think both sides, the Republicans and Democrats, do not want to shut down. They are really trying hard to avoid a shutdown. I suspect they will avoid it in some way.
We don't want to shut down. We've seen all the headlines about Sell America in financial markets. But then I listen to the CEOs in America and the global CEOs as well who are investing in America. Do you sense a disconnect between the headlines and where the money's going at the moment?
Well, there's no doubt that people are a little more nervous about investing in America than maybe people would like who are trying to get them to invest in America, because there is some concern about the dollar going down. If you invest in the United States and the dollar goes down, the value of your investment obviously is not as good as you thought. But it's not been the major cause of concern for foreign investors. They're just worried about where the U.S. government is going. It's very hard to predict where the U.S. government is going for a lot of foreign investors. People want, business people, predictability. Tell me what the rules are, and I will follow the rules. And sometimes the rules are unpredictable or they change a lot. So to the extent that there's consistency, I think more and more people will invest in the U.S. But to the extent that there's inconsistency, people will pull back a bit. And particularly the dollar is an issue as well.
But that's Trump in a nutshell. Uncertainty is a feature of him. That is what he does. And now it's an election year. So what kind of unpredictability can we see this year alone?
Well, I can't predict the unpredictability of the leadership of the government, but I would say there are a lot of issues that people are worried about. And right now, I would say the U.S. economy seems to be doing pretty well. I think growth is pretty good. Inflation's pretty much under control, relatively speaking. It's not going to be at 2%. And unemployment is at a tolerable level. It's not as low as we might want. But generally, the economy is in pretty good shape. And whatever people might say about Jay Powell, and I'm a big supporter of his, we haven't had a recession under Jay Powell's leadership. Normally, Fed chairs often get blamed for recessions. Other people get blamed too. But he's had to increase interest rates to deal with high inflation, and he's had to lower them when inflation came back. And normally, when you increase and you decrease, you get some kind of recession along the way. We haven't had a recession. So in my view, he's done a pretty good job.
Having known the man, do you think he's going to entertain any questions today regarding will he stay on after his chairmanship, or the more assertive stance he's taken against the White House?
I don't want to pretend to speak for him, but I would be surprised if he said anything other than, here's what we did today.
Boring.
But it's actually interesting because when you had previous Fed chairs, they didn't tell you what they were going to do in advance, and they didn't explain it 30 minutes later. He does it in English so you can understand. So I think to his credit, he actually explains what he's doing, and people can understand it. Many times the Fed never actually had press conferences before, so I think he's done a pretty good job, and I suspect in the end he will announce at the appropriate time what he's going to do.
He is not Greenspan, that's for sure. It's a very different communication style, without a doubt.
It's different than Alan Greenspan or Paul Volcker. They were more, I would say, difficult to understand.
David, tons of volatility around this institution. I've been surprised by how it hasn't really been consequential at all in financial markets. I struggle to find a read-through from the volatility around the institution and how it's rippling through financial markets. In fact, the Treasury market has been very resilient in the face of a lot of risk. As a market participant like yourself, what's your conclusion as you see that play out?
Well, I think people are unclear where the government policy is in some areas, and therefore they are hesitant about making some long-term commitments. But on the whole, the business community is more or less supportive of what the federal government is doing. I mean, most of the CEOs are more or less in line. I mean, they don't agree with everything the administration is doing, but they recognize that there's less regulation than there was before. It's easier to get a decision about mergers or acquisitions than it might have been before. So I think some business people are pleased with it, but some business people are basically doing what they need to do to help their company, but they may not personally believe in everything that the president is doing.